Hey guys, for today's session, we are going to be going over Chapter 6, which is over interest groups. So I want to start today's session by just defining what is an interest group. An interest group is a voluntary organization that strives to influence public policy. This is also sometimes known as a pressure group. There are three primary types of interest groups. There are economic interest groups, non-economic interest groups, and mixed interest groups. Economic interest groups seek financial advantage. Non-economic groups seek the betterment of society. Note that that is the betterment of society as perceived by the members of that interest group. So that doesn't necessarily have to be your perception of what betters society, but it's the group's perception of what betters society. Finally, there are mixed interest groups. These are groups that pursue social goals that have economic effects. So let's look at some examples of this. Here you can see that we've classified the different types of interest groups. We've got economic, non-economic, and mixed. So when we look at economic, you can see that most of those groups are made up of industry professionals, Texas Farm Bureau, Texas Association of Business. These are going to be groups that are focused on getting subsidies, on making sure that they get tax advantages, all things that are going to help them economically. The non-economic groups are where we're going to see things like personal liberties or abortion or the environment. So the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, that's going to be a really good example. Texas State Rifle Association, also a great example of a non-economic interest group. Again, not necessarily your view of what betters society, but what is the group's view of what betters society. Mixed interest groups, remember, are going to be those groups that have dual goals. They're going to be groups that are both trying to better society and seek financial advantage. So good examples of these are going to be the Texas State Teachers Association. From the economic perspective, they're going to be going in and trying to influence policies such as increasing teacher pay, increasing teacher benefits. But when we look at those non-economic issues, they're also going to be advocating for things like smaller classroom sizes or for less standardized testing, all things that in their view help better society as a whole. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more of a concrete idea of the different types of interest groups. Note that when we're talking about interest groups, you can see from this diagram that they can go in and they can influence all three branches of government as well as the political environment. Now, when we start our discussion, we're going to start by talking about how interest groups can influence the Texas legislature. The reason for that is that the legislature is going to be the branch of government that is most commonly targeted by these interest groups. But understand that they can also target the executive branch, the judiciary, and the political environment. So let's go through and let's start by looking at some of the ways that they can target the legislature. So before an interest group can even start to lobby, let's just define what is lobbying. Lobbying is directly contacting public officials to advocate for a public policy. Oftentimes, these special interest groups are going to hire professional lobbyists. Those are individuals whose whole job it is to go in and try to influence policymakers to pursue their social or economic change. So before a lobbyist can even go and start to lobby over at the legislature, they need to do some things to prepare to lobby. One of these things is going to be socializing. So they want to socialize with both House members and Senate members and their staff, because the staff for both the House and the Senate are going to be exceptionally important individuals that those lobbyists are going to deal with most of the time. So socializing is going to be key here. Think of that expression, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Unfortunately, sometimes that is very true. Socializing is going to be a big deal. They're also going to have to figure out which key legislators do I want to target. Now, this part gets a little bit tricky because they do Chapter 6 before Chapter 7 in your textbook. So we're just going to talk in really broad strokes about which legislators to target, and understand that we're going to get a little bit more in depth on this when we get to Chapter 7. So the first thing that you're going to need is somebody who you think is going to be really sympathetic to the policy change that you want to see implemented. This individual is going to be a bill sponsor. The bill sponsor is the member of the legislature who actually introduces that piece of legislation. So they need to be somebody who can strongly advocate for the legislation. So you want to find somebody who's very, very strongly on your side to begin with. You're going to want to identify who's on your side, who's against you, and also who's on the fence. Now, why do you want to identify who's against you? Well, if you can't convince those legislators to be on your side, you at least want to try to make them not be quite so vocal about their opposition. In addition, you're going to want to go in and try to lobby to both the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor. All that you have to know about those two positions right now for this chapter is that the Speaker of the House is going to be the presiding officer over the House chamber. The Lieutenant Governor is going to be the presiding officer over the Texas Senate. So those two individuals, because they're the presiding officers, are going to have a lot of control and discretion over what happens with bills in their chambers. It's really important to get those two individuals on your team. Finally, without going into too much detail, understand that there are going to be committees within the legislature. Committees are basically groups that are targeted to focus on specific types of issues. So agriculture, energy, education. They really specialize in a particular topic. You want to try to identify which committee is likely to get your bill and target those committee members, as well as the committee chairperson. Those committees are going to be really, really important for reasons that are going to become much more apparent when we look at Chapter 7. Now, you've targeted those key legislators. What are you going to bring them? How are you going to lobby? This is what we call tools of persuasion in your textbook. How are you going to convince these individuals that you are right? Well, in a few different ways. You're going to go ahead and you are going to bring them research. You're also going to bring them data, statistics on what the constituents within their particular polling location think. So the people that you represent, how do they feel about this particular issue? You want to bring them the pros and the cons of the particular legislative issue that you're tackling, because remember, they're going to have to defend it. So you don't want to send them in just to be totally blindsided by the other side. And you might want to actually draft up a proposed piece of legislation. Now, the bill sponsor might change it to reflect what they think is more in line with what can be passed, but giving them that draft piece of legislation gives them a starting point. So those are some of the ways that you can target and lobby the legislature. Obviously, you can also do things like try to get people out to vote. You can also do things like donating to campaigns. But remember, the donating to campaign part is really less important than the mobilizing members and influencing policy choices. Most of the time when we're really talking about going in and raising capital for a campaign. Remember, most of the time we're talking about PAC. So for special interest groups, we're really focused on policy change. Okay, so that's going to be the legislative branch. Let's take a look at the executive branch. And remember, just as a reminder, the executive branch is going to be the branch of government that is in charge of enforcing the laws. So, if we're looking at the executive branch is basically in charge of implementing rules. So, the rulemaking process, as we understand it, has two key parts: implementation and discretion. The agencies within the executive branch are able to set rules that are actually really important. They don't feel like they would be, but they are. The legislature is basically given broad discretion to these different executive agencies and boards to implement the legislature's policies. So, for example, let's go back to the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. The TCEQ is actually able to set rules that govern where radioactive waste will be disposed of and how close to a waterway it can be disposed of. If that rule gets changed, that can obviously have real-life impacts on the individuals who live near a particular waterway. So the executive branch has a lot of discretion or flexibility in terms of how they implement rules. Now, the types of rules that they implement are going to be up to them, but what they need to do is, prior to adopting a new rule, they publish the proposed rule in something called the Texas Register. The Texas Register is going to be the official publication for the state of Texas and its executive agencies. And what I want to do is I'm actually going to see if I can pull up the Texas Register for y'all to take a look at. So pause for me just really quickly here. Okay, let me get off of this screen and navigate over. Okay, so here we're looking at the most recent version of the Texas Register. And you can see here, these are the proposed rules. Now, when these proposed rules come out, they're open for public comment. That means that anyone can write in to the Texas Register and tell these executive agencies what they think about these proposed rules. But I want you to take a look at this. All right, most people don't have enough free time to go through and read the entirety of these rules. And you're going to see here, if it's a totally new rule, then you're just going to see text. But here you can see underlines and you can also see cross-outs. What that means is there is an existing rule that they want to change in some way. So here, they've gone through, they've added some language, and they've also deleted some language. So you can see just scrolling through here that this is not exactly what somebody would call a light read. It goes on for quite some time. Let's see how long this particular edition is. Okay, so this particular edition looks to be about 48-ish pages. So obviously that's going to be pretty time consuming. It's written in a lot of legalese. So the general public has the opportunity to comment on these rules, but they oftentimes don't. Why this becomes important is because those comments are actually looked at by these executive agencies, and once they've looked at the responses, they decide whether or not this is going to become the official rule for their agency. Now, if the general public is not writing in, who do you think is writing in? Let's go back to sharing that PowerPoint real quick. We're going to be on slide 8 here if you're following along. Clientele groups are going to be the ones who are writing in. So let's talk about what is a clientele group. Clientele groups are the groups that are most affected by a government agency's regulations and programs. Frequently, these interest groups form close alliances with the agencies that are supposed to be governing them, and those relationships are based on mutual support and accommodation. So the clientele group will actually write in and tell the agency that's supposed to be overseeing them how they feel about this particular rule. So let's go to the whiteboard and let's illustrate an example here. Okay. Let's take TREC. TREC stands for the Texas Real Estate Commission. So their clientele group, the group that they're in charge of overseeing, are going to be Texas realtors and brokers. Okay, so let's make up a proposed rule. Let's say that the Texas Real Estate Commission wants to make sure that brokers, who are basically just the realtors' bosses, are really experienced and really know what they're doing. So let's say they draft a proposed rule, and that proposed rule that's published in the Texas Register is going to say, this is totally pretend, this is not a real rule, that brokers have to first be licensed realtors for 20 years. Okay. The Texas Real Estate Commission is doing this because they're trying to protect the general public. They're supposed to be regulating the Texas brokers and the Texas realtors. So that's the purpose of this rule that they're instituting. Here's the problem, though. Is the Texas public going to write in to say, wow, we looked through all 48 or 46 or whatever pages there were of the Texas Register, we read this rule, and we think that's great, we're really happy about this? No, they're probably not going to do that. Instead, who is going to write in response to that proposed rule change? The Texas brokers and realtors. And they're probably not going to be very happy about it. Even though it would mean that we've got more experienced bosses for the realtors and really helps out the general public, it's probably not actually going to be great for Texas brokers and realtors because it's going to take a lot longer for a realtor to become a broker. So there might be some brokers who are on board with it, but overall, the Texas brokers and realtors aren't going to be in favor of this. Their interests are going to diverge from that of the public. So it's important to understand this Texas Register process where these interest groups are trying to target the rulemaking process. That can sometimes have unintended consequences, where that clientele group is exerting a lot of influence over the executive agency that's supposed to be regulating them. The other way that these special interest groups can go in and target these executive agencies is through the appointment process. So think back to Chapter 3. In Chapter 3, we talked about how the governor gets to go in and make appointments with the confirmation of the Senate. So in our example, if you wanted to target the appointment process, you would go to the governor and you would try to influence the governor and the governor's staff to make appointments to the board for individuals who are maybe part of your interest group, who align with your policy goals. Once you've got people on the board who align with your policy goals, it's going to be a lot easier to get those rule changes through that you want to see. This process of targeting the appointment process and also targeting the rulemaking process is known as co-optation. Co-optation is a development of such a close alliance between state regulatory agencies and their clientele groups that the regulated have in effect become the regulator. The interest group manages to capture such complete control of their regulatory agency that they are essentially self-regulated. So the example that I use when we're doing real life class is I tell my students, if I were to draft up an exam and hand it out to all of you and say, give me your comments, give me your thoughts, what are most people going to say? Most people aren't going to say, you should make this harder. You should make us study more. You should make sure that we know this material more in depth. Most people are going to act in their own self-interest, which they view to be make the regulations on us easier, make the tests easier and simpler for us to understand. The same thing is going on with co-optation when we look at the executive branch. Okay, we're going to switch back over to our PowerPoint file. And we're going to pick up with targeting the courts. So we've already talked about the legislature and the executive branch. Now we're moving on to targeting the court system. So let's start by just talking about influencing the judicial selection process. In Texas, almost all of our courts are selected by partisan elections. You'll remember that from our discussions in Chapter 3. So partisan elections, remember, just means that the Texas public goes out and they vote judges into office, and those judges are voted in part based on their political preference, Republicans or Democrats. So influencing the judicial selection process is where these special interest groups go out and try to make sure that their candidate is elected into a judicial position. So if you're really pro-Second Amendment rights and you're a member of the Texas State Rifle Association or the National Rifle Association, maybe you want to go and make sure that your district court judges that are appointed to that position are people who are former NRA members. Or if you're really concerned about First Amendment protections and you're the ACLU, maybe you want to go out and try to get people elected into those district court positions who have taken a lot of free speech cases and have advocated really strongly for that. So you're going to go out, you can donate to campaigns, you can do bumper stickers and yard signs and all of those other things that you traditionally see associated with a campaign. You can also file suit in court. So if you think back on Chapter 1, when we talk about the struggle for equal rights in Texas, almost all of those cases are going to be examples of interest groups targeting the judicial branch. Think about Brown versus Board of Education. In Brown v. Board, the NAACP knew that if they went in and they targeted the legislature, or if they went in and targeted the executive branch, they probably weren't going to get very far. So instead, what they did is they went in and they tried to argue that these laws, these rules were unconstitutional. Because remember, even though the judiciary can't write statutory laws, it does have the common law. So every time those judges issue an opinion, they set a precedent that becomes a type of law in the United States. So all of those cases that we studied in the civil rights portion of Chapter 1, those are going to be good examples of interest groups going in and targeting the court system to try to enact change. Okay. Shaping the political environment. So first of all, let's talk about what does it mean to shape the political environment. Basically, what this means is you're going in and you're trying to change public perception. Now, a good way to think about this is, let's talk about recreational marijuana legislation. Some of you are probably too young for this example, so I'm going to give you a little bit of context. But nowadays, there's a really large movement for legalizing marijuana for recreational use. If we hop back in time to as early as the 1990s, if you had talked about legalizing marijuana for medicinal use to a state legislator, they probably would have looked at you like you were nuts. It was not an idea that had gained a lot of mainstream traction. So before you could go to one of the three branches of government and lobby, what you probably needed to do was go out and influence public opinion. You needed to shape the political environment before you could begin to go over and start targeting the branches of government. So that's what we mean by shaping the political environment. Understand that this can include educating the public, contributing to campaigns, and it can also include organizing public demonstrations. Now, one thing that gets a lot of bad press is something called AstroTurf lobbying. AstroTurf is just that fake grass. So they call it AstroTurf lobbying because it's where special interest groups orchestrate demonstrations that are supposed to give the impression of widespread and spontaneous public support. If you ever hear somebody talking about like paid protesters or paid marchers, they're talking about an example of AstroTurf lobbying. Generally speaking, if you can organize a large public demonstration, it brings media attention to your issue in a good way. You do have to be careful, though, because that can obviously backfire if, for any reason, the march or the demonstration turns violent or if riots break out. So sometimes not all publicity is good publicity. In the context of demonstrations, it's really better if they're peaceable. So let's talk about Texas interest groups on the whole. Let's talk about who is most powerful in the state of Texas. So Texas' most powerful interest groups are going to be energy and natural resources. And on slide 13, there's actually a visual depiction for you to take a look at. So you can see here we've got energy and natural resources accounting for quite a bit. You've also got finance and real estate, general business, and health. So you're going to see these constitute a pretty large portion of that pie chart. Now, notice that your textbook is also going to talk about something called umbrella organizations. Umbrella organizations are associations formed by smaller interest groups joining together to promote common policy goals by making campaign contributions and hiring lobbyists to represent their interests. So let's go back to our realtor example. If we just had smaller pockets of realtors, like let's say the Northwest Association of Realtors and the Northeast Association of Realtors and all of these different associations that were joining together and trying to lobby the Texas legislature on their own, That wouldn't be as effective as if those different associations decide to join as one. If each of those associations decides that it's going to go out and it's going to lobby as its own thing, it represents less members and it's going to have less financial support, which means that they're not going to be able to provide the same level of resources or hire the same level of lobbyists that other organizations that have a larger coalition of members are going to be able to muster. So instead, it makes more sense for all of those realtors from those different pockets of Texas to join together into the Texas Association of Realtors. And at that point, they can probably hire a really prominent lobbying firm like Hilco, and they can probably pay a lot of money for market research and for lobbying efforts. So all of that is why some of these smaller associations form together in umbrella organizations. Your textbook is going to talk about Tesla as an example of the power of lobbying and these special interest groups. They use this example to highlight that it's not all about the money. It's really about who can mobilize members to vote or to not vote. So Tesla does not employ a traditional dealer-oriented model in which it sends electric cars to dealers who in turn sell the cars to the public. Instead, it avoids the middleman dealers and sells its cars directly to consumers. That practice, however, is against the law in Texas, meaning the only way Texans can buy one of Tesla's Model S or Model X or Model 3 cars is to order it online. Now, notice we do have like storefront in Texas, so you can go into a Tesla storefront. I think there's one in like South Lake, I want to say, and also maybe in Dallas. That's just an aside. But they're not going to have the traditional automobile dealership model that we see here. You're going to basically, you can be led to a computer and you can purchase the car on your own, but you're not going to have the traditional salesperson relationship that you have in a true automobile dealership. So Tesla decides that they want to go in and they want to be able to sell directly to consumers in Texas. Well, it's against the law here in the state. So Tesla spent over $1 million on lobbying efforts to open 12 stores. They've done this now for at least the last 2 legislative sessions, but possibly longer. And so far, they have been met with a great deal of opposition from the TADA. The TADA is the Texas Automobile Dealers Association, and they have worked very hard to defeat Tesla. TADA represents over 1,200 automobile dealerships in the state of Texas. Now, at this point, you might pause and say, why does TADA care at all about Tesla? Tesla is not a super popular name here in the state of Texas like it is in some other states. Well, the problem with what Tesla wants to do is if Tesla is allowed to do this, then Chevy's allowed to do it, and Honda's allowed to do it, and Ford is allowed to do it. And so that's really what TADA is concerned about, because if this direct-to-consumer model is allowed, there's going to be a lot of individuals who own and work in those automobile dealerships who are going to be out of a job. So even though Tesla spent all of this money, overall, they have been unsuccessful. Now, if I were a betting person, I would say that they're probably going to continue their efforts. And at some point, who knows, potentially they could win. But right now, the Texas legislature understands that the members of TADA go out and vote. And if they side with Tesla, there is a really good chance that they will be voted out of office. So as of right now, it has not made a difference that Tesla has spent all of this money, because the real key to special interest groups is, can they mobilize their members? So this next part that we're getting to here on slide 15 is going to be the political theory part of this chapter. So the first concept that we're going to talk about is something called the Iron Triangle. The Iron Triangle is a long-standing alliance among interest groups, legislators, and bureaucrats that's held together by mutual self-interest. They act as a subsystem in the legislative and administrative decision-making process. So let's flip back to our whiteboard and let's do an example. Okay. Let me just start by drawing the triangle for us. So for those of you who are more visual, you'll be able to see this. Notice there are going to be 3 points to that triangle. So one of the points is going to be the special interest group, which we're just going to abbreviate as SI, special interest group. Another of the points on the triangle is going to be the legislature, and another point is going to be the executive branch. So let's say that we were talking about the Texas Oil and Gas Association. Okay, that's our interest group. That interest group is going to work really closely with the Energy Committee in the Texas legislature. They're also going to work really closely with the Texas Railroad Commission, which is going to sound funny, but when we get to the Chapter 8 section, you're going to understand that the Texas Railroad Commission actually does not regulate railroads. It regulates oil and gas interests. So over here, we've got the special interest group, and they're working really closely with both the legislative branch and the executive branch, and specifically these individuals in both of those branches. All of these people are exchanging information. They're exchanging what the executive branch's proposed rules are going to look like, what the legislature is considering in terms of proposed legislation, information, proposed rule changes. All of that is circulating among these 3 points. What that means is they form a very close relationship with one another, which can be good in that oftentimes they trust one another and they're getting a lot of feedback from other people who are working really closely with the industry. But it can be bad in that sometimes that relationship might look too close for comfort. We maybe don't want those 2 branches to be that closely associated with a special interest group. So that's what an iron triangle looks like. Let's go back over to our PowerPoint slide. And for those of you who are following along, you went over to the whiteboard. We're going over to slide 15. So next up, we've got issue networks. Issue networks are dynamic alliances among a wide range of individuals and groups that are activated by broad public policy questions. So an example of an issue network would be that Wendy Davis clip that we watched, where you saw all of these different individuals coming together at the Texas Capitol. So not all of those individuals were from the same group. You had people from the ACLU who were joining together with Planned Parenthood and with different pro-choice groups and different civil liberties groups across Texas. So you had all of these groups of different individuals who were converging around this broad public policy issue. Sometimes those issue networks can actually develop into something called a political movement. A political movement is a mass alliance of like-minded groups and individuals seeking broad changes in the direction of government policy. The Tea Party is going to be an example of a political movement. So it's a group of like-minded individuals who are concerned about government overreach and spending. So they're concerned about things like the Affordable Care Act, about increased taxation, about basically economic policy and keeping the government fairly limited in its role in the economy. That would be an example of a political movement. So next up, let's talk about what's good about interest groups, and let's talk about what's bad about interest groups. Good thing about interest groups, they provide representation for people. So anyone out there can go and they can join one or more interest groups. There's a ton of different interest groups. One of the examples that I use that I'm a part of, because it's non-controversial, so I feel comfortable sharing this one with you, is the Texas Humane Legislative Network. The Texas Humane Legislative Network is basically a group that's dedicated to advocating for puppies and kittens. And there aren't really that many people out there who are anti-puppies and kittens. So they also do things like they go in and they advocate for horses and livestock and things as well. But it's basically trying to make sure that animals are treated ethically in the state of Texas. So I, as an individual, or the other members of that group, are not super likely to go out and contact our individual legislators. If we do, it's probably going to be like in an email format or a particular phone call about a particular policy issue that we feel strongly about. We're probably not going to have like a really close working relationship with a legislator. But by joining one of those special interest groups, we're able to have a voice in what's going on. Because our special interest group is going to go out and they're going to hire a lobbyist, and that lobbyist is going to form that close relationship with the legislator. They are going to go out and bring them all of that information that we were talking about, and the polling numbers and all of those other things that probably most individuals aren't going to be able to bring to their legislator. So it's a way for individuals to find representation, and it's also a way for a group of like-minded individuals to mobilize and try to get a candidate that really cares about their particular issues and causes elected. There's also this thing called pluralist theory, and that is the view that in a free society, public policy should be made by a multitude of competing interest groups, ensuring that policies will not benefit a single elite at the expense of the many. So this idea of pluralism or pluralist theory is that we have all of these different interest groups out there, and they're all able to bring all of this information and data and polling research to the people who are in power. And so the people in power are able to look over all of that different information, and they're able to figure out, okay, well, I think this policy makes the most sense for the public. So the idea that everybody can have some form of voice in that process is that idea of pluralist theory. Now, criticisms of these special interest groups include this elitism or elitist theory that you're going to hear referenced in your textbook. And this is the view that the state is ruled by a small number of participants who exercise power to further their own self-interest. So this is the idea that if you are able to participate in a special interest group in a meaningful way, you're more likely to be affluent. If you're working like a minimum wage job, 60 hours a week, you probably don't have a whole lot of time to go in and devote to extra things like special interest groups. Whereas if you have a little bit more cushy, luxurious job, you probably have more time, you're probably better educated on how the process works, and you probably have more money to give to that group. So this elitist theory is the idea that while pluralist theory says that we're going to have all these competing voices and that the people in power are going to be able to take the best voice and use that one. In reality, some voices might be louder than others. And usually the louder voices are the people who have more money. So that's one of the criticisms that we're going to see for these interest groups. Another criticism that we're going to see is that they exploit weak state institutions. So let's think about the Texas legislature as an example of this. The Texas legislature, remember, is pretty constrained in what they're able to do. And we've talked about that a little bit. We're going to talk more about it in Chapter 7. They're only meeting once every 2 years for 140 days, unless they're called in special session, in which case they'll go in for a little bit longer. Well, that's not a whole lot of time. And those legislators are only working part-time. They have other jobs for the most part. So they don't have access necessarily to a lot of time or resources to draft their own legislation, which means that to a certain extent, they're going to be reliant on those special interest groups to bring them research and to bring them drafts of proposed legislation. It's a little bit worrying because those special interest groups, by definition, are going to have an agenda. And so we don't necessarily want our legislators to be looking at information that has an agenda associated with it. Finally, we also have criticisms that deal with the revolving door and a conflict of interest. The revolving door is the idea that people within the Texas legislature can move straight over from working in the Texas legislature to working as a lobbyist. And that's why, in fact, many people do decide to work in the Texas legislature. While you only get paid $7,200 a year to work as a Texas legislator, if you go and work for one of the prestigious lobbying firms in Austin, it's really likely that you're probably making somewhere in the six-figure range. So that's a big difference. And if you're making $300,000 a year, that's a pretty nice salary. Well, if a piece of legislation lands on your desk that's from Hilco, and they say, hey, we'd like you to be the bill sponsor, and you know that Hilco will be really, really pleased about it, but you know that it's not necessarily that good for your constituents. If you're looking for a job with Hilco when you get out of office, that's going to represent a conflict of interest. There's one interest, which would be, let me sponsor this bill for Hilco because I want to be hired by them. That's your self-interest. But that's in conflict with what would actually be best for your constituents. So a conflict of interest is just a situation in which public officers stand to benefit personally from their official decisions. So those are some of the criticisms that we see. Another one that we're going to see is going to be something called late train contribution. These are biennial fundraising events in Austin that happen after each election. And this is when campaign funds are given to the wrong candidate. I'm taping this at 5:30 in the morning, so bear with me. Campaign funds are given to the winning candidate after the election up to 30 days before the legislature comes into session. Such contributions are designed to curry favor with winning candidates. So what does that kind of sound like? It kind of sounds like a legal bribe, right? There's no prohibition on these, so long as they come in within 30 days before the start of the legislative session. If they come in closer to that time frame, then they're prohibited. So how do we go in and how do we regulate lobbying in Texas? Well, first, we require lobbyists to file something called lobbyist reports. These lobbyist reports are designed to provide information to the general public on what lobbyists are doing and who they're influencing. So it requires them to report their actual clients, their general areas of policy concern, the range of compensation that they're receiving, their expenditures on communication to support or oppose legislation, and their expenditures on state legislators. But there are a number of tricks that you can use if you're a lobbyist to try to make that information a little bit less transparent to the public. General areas of policy concern is a good example of this. Instead of talking about a particular bill that you're lobbying for or against, if you were representing Verizon, you could just go in and say, I'm lobbying for telecommunications services. Okay, that's really broad, and that really doesn't tell you a whole lot about what in particular that lobbyist was really lobbying for. Another thing that you see is those expenditures. So a trick Texas lobbyists use to avoid reporting who they took to dinner or concert or sporting event is to split the bill with other lobbyists to keep it below the reporting threshold. So you find other lobbyists who are also lobbying for this particular bill or against this particular bill. You all take this particular legislator out to dinner or out to the sports game or out golfing or wherever it is that you want to take them to impress them. If you can keep it below a certain amount that you individually as a lobbyist have spent, then you don't have to report, which means that there's less transparency for the voting public. Overall, even though we have these lobbying reports, critics say that the public tends to be pretty ill-informed. Remember, we don't really have that many people in Texas even turning up to vote, let alone going out and looking up these lobbying reports. The Texas Ethics Commission is criticized for not really being very vigorous in terms of enforcing their reporting requirements. And there's been some effort to change this, but they've been largely unsuccessful. Governor Abbott declared ethics reform to be one of 5 high priority items in 2015, but he failed at legislation for ethics reform. There was only one category in which he was able to see some level of change, and that was at a local municipal level, and even that had loopholes in it. So overall, where does the state of Texas rank in public integrity reports? Overall, not great, although I will point out we have an A in state budget processes, so that's good. One thing I will say is these public integrity reports are notorious for being pretty hard graders. Even with that said, overall, the state of Texas is obviously not doing super great when it comes to our accountability standards. So that's going to be it for Chapter 6. I'm trying to scroll back through the slides, make sure that I didn't miss anything while we were going through. Don't believe I did. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to email, or we can always set up an individual Blackboard Collaborate session to talk further. Other than that, I hope you have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.